My name is Douglas Patterson. What I'm about to tell you happened to me and my family during the summer of 1963, a summer that changed our lives forever. I still get chills thinking about those 7 days we spent in that cursed valley in southern Utah. Back then, I was a 45-year-old archaeology professor, living what I thought was a perfectly normal life with my wife Helen and our son Michael. Helen was a brilliant botanist, always excited about discovering new plants. And Michael, well, he was just a regular 13-year-old kid who loved taking pictures with his new camera. We were supposed to be on a simple research trip. Helen wanted to study some rare desert plants, and I was interested in exploring some ancient Native American sites in the area. We packed up our 1961 Airstream land yacht, that's what we called our RV back then, and headed out to this remote canyon locals called Skinwalker Valley. I remember Michael sitting in the back seat, clicking away with his camera as we drove through the dusty roads. Helen was marking spots on her map where she wanted to collect plant samples. Everything seemed so normal, so innocent. If only we had listened to the warnings. If only we had noticed the signs earlier. You see, what happened in that valley wasn't just scary, it was impossible. The kind of impossible that makes you question everything you believe in. But I need to tell this story. People need to know what's out there, hiding in those remote canyons, wearing faces that aren't their own. Let me start from the beginning, from that first day when we met Red Thompson, the old ranch owner who would later, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand how it all started, how we found ourselves trapped in a nightmare that no science or logic could explain. This is our story. Every word of it is true, though I sometimes wish it wasn't. And even now, years later, I still check my mirrors at night, wondering if something followed us home from that valley. Day one started normally enough. We arrived at Skinwalker Valley around noon. The sun was beating down hard, and the air was so dry it made your throat scratch. As we pulled up in our RV, I noticed how quiet everything was. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just silence. Red Thompson was waiting for us near the entrance to his ranch. He was tall and thin, with skin like old leather from years under the desert sun. He seemed friendly enough, waving at us with a weathered hand, but something about his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the valley, folks," he said, helping us park our RV in a flat spot near some old juniper trees. "Just remember, stick to the main paths and don't go wandering after dark." While Helen and I were setting up camp, Michael went off with his camera to take pictures of the canyon. That's when we saw the first strange thing. About 50 yards from our campsite, there was a dead cow. Now, finding dead cattle isn't unusual in ranch country. But this was different. The cuts on it looked too clean, too precise. Like something you'd see in a surgery room, not out in the wild. Later that afternoon, an old Native American woman named Mary Running Horse came to our camp. She didn't say hello or introduce herself. She just stood there, looking at us with worried eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "Not now. Not during the ceremony time." Helen tried to ask her what she meant, but Mary just shook her head and pointed at the strange rock drawings nearby. Petroglyphs, showing human figures changing into animals. "Those who wear others walk here," she whispered, and then left before we could ask more questions. That night, things got weird. The temperature dropped suddenly, even though it was midsummer. Our dog, Max, who never barked at anything, wouldn't stop growling at the darkness. And the coyotes, their howls sounded wrong, almost like they were trying to speak words. Michael showed me the photos he took that day. Most were normal. Rocks, cacti, the canyon walls. But there was one that made my stomach turn. In the background, barely visible, was a figure. It looked human, but something was off about it. Like a drawing where all the proportions are slightly wrong. I told myself it was just shadows playing tricks, that Mary's warning was just local superstition. I was a man of science after all. But as I lay in my sleeping bag that first night, listening to those not quite right coyote calls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a terrible mistake coming here. If only I'd known then what I know now. The second day started with a discovery that made my skin crawl. Helen's plant samples, which she had carefully collected and stored in her special containers, had turned completely black overnight. Not just wilted or dried, they looked like they had been rotting for weeks. Helen was confused. She'd been collecting plants for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. But that wasn't the strangest thing that morning. Max, our usually playful German shepherd, was acting weird. He stayed under the RV, refusing to come out even for food. His eyes looked different somehow, scared in a way I'd never seen before. Michael spent the morning developing some photos in his makeshift darkroom, just a small tent with his equipment. When he came out, his face was pale. "Dad," he said, showing me the pictures from yesterday, "look at these." The photos showed the canyon, normal at first glance, but in each one there was something off. Shadows that didn't match the sun's position. Dark figures standing in places where we knew no one had been. And in one photo, clear as day, was Red Thompson standing by a rock. But his neck was too long, and his arms hung down past his knees. "That's impossible," I said, trying to sound calm for Michael's sake. "Must be something wrong with the camera." Around noon, Red Thompson himself showed up at our camp. He was acting strange, twitching and sniffing the air like an animal. He asked us weird questions about our family, our home, what route we took to get here. Normal questions, I guess, but something about the way he asked them made my neck hair stand up. Then Helen came running back from her plant collecting. She was shaking. "I just saw Red Thompson down by the creek," she said, pointing south. "But he's here. How can he be here?" Red just smiled, a wide, wrong sort of smile, and walked away without saying anything. That evening, we found strange symbols carved into our RV's door. They looked fresh, but we hadn't heard anyone near our camp. Max was gone too. We called and searched for hours, but he never came back. As night fell, the temperature dropped again, much colder than it should be in summer. We huddled in our RV, listening to those weird coyote calls that sounded more and more like words. Michael swore he could hear his name being called. I kept telling myself there had to be logical explanations for everything, but deep down, I was starting to realize we were dealing with something that logic couldn't explain. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The morning of day 3 hit us with more strangeness. We woke up to find a perfect circle of dead rabbits around our RV, not torn up or bloody, just lying there like they'd all decided to go to sleep and never wake up. Michael refused to take pictures of them. I couldn't blame him. While making breakfast, Helen spotted something that made her drop her coffee cup. Red Thompson was standing at the edge of our camp, just staring. Nothing too weird about that, except he was also walking his fence line half a mile away. We could see him clearly in both places. "Douglas," Helen whispered, gripping my arm, "this isn't right. We need to leave." But when we tried to start the RV, it wouldn't work. Everything was fine mechanically. It just wouldn't start, like something was holding it back. Around midday, I went to check out some ancient ceremonial grounds I'd found earlier. The dirt there was strange, ice cold despite the hot sun. I found broken pottery pieces scattered around, and on them were drawings of creatures that looked half human, half animal. While I was examining them, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Mary Running Horse again. She looked scared. "You've seen them now, haven't you?" she asked. "The ones who wear others? They're getting stronger. Tonight is their night." Before I could ask what she meant, we heard Michael screaming back at camp. We ran back to find him shaking, holding his camera. He'd been taking pictures of the canyon when he saw something through his lens, a figure that looked like Red Thompson, but its face was moving, like clay being reshaped. "It saw me," Michael kept saying. "It smiled at me with too many teeth." That afternoon, a local sheriff's deputy came by to check on us. He'd gotten reports of strange noises. While talking to us, he kept touching his face, like he wasn't used to wearing it. When he turned to leave, Helen gasped. The back of his uniform was covered in dirt and blood, like he'd been lying face down somewhere. As the sun started setting, we heard it. Dozens of coyotes howling. But the sound was all wrong. It was like they were speaking English, calling our names, asking us to come out and play. We locked ourselves in the RV. Through the windows, we could see shapes moving in the darkness. Some walked like people, others crawled like animals, and some moved in ways nothing should move. That's when we heard a scratching on our RV's roof, and a voice that sounded exactly like mine asked, "Let me in?" The night had only just begun. That night was the longest of our lives. The scratching on our RV's roof continued for hours. Sometimes it sounded like claws, other times like human fingernails. The voices outside kept changing, first mine, then Helen's, then Michael's, even Max's barking. But we knew none of them were real. Around midnight, the temperature inside the RV dropped so low we could see our breath. The windows started frosting over, even though it was supposed to be a hot summer night. Through the foggy glass, we saw multiple versions of Red Thompson walking around our RV, each one moving in slightly different ways. Michael was huddled in the corner with his camera, taking pictures even though his hands were shaking. Helen held onto our emergency radio, trying to call for help, but all we got was static and strange whispers. Then, we heard it, a sound like wet cloth tearing. Looking out the window, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. One of the Red Thompsons was changing. Its skin was stretching and peeling, like someone taking off a suit. Underneath wasn't flesh or bone, but something dark and wrong. "Don't look," I told my family, but it was too late. That's when Helen remembered something Mary had said about light, how these creatures, these skinwalkers, hated bright light. Michael's camera had a powerful flash. It was our only chance. Just then, something started pushing through the RV's door. The metal was bending inward, making horrible creaking sounds. We could see fingers, too long and too many of them, curling around the edge of the door. "Michael," I whispered, "when I say now, use your flash. Helen, be ready to run." The door burst open. What stood there wasn't Red Thompson anymore. It wasn't anything that should exist. But before it could come in, I shouted, "Now!" Michael's camera flash lit up the night like lightning. The thing in the doorway screamed, not like a person or an animal, but like many voices screaming together. It stumbled backward, its shape melting and changing. We ran. We ran faster than we ever had before, straight toward Mary Running Horse's house at the edge of the valley. Behind us, we could hear them chasing. The sound of too many feet. Some human, some animal, all running together. But every time they got close, Michael would turn and use his flash. Each time, the creatures would shriek and fall back. We were almost to Mary's house when I looked back one last time. What I saw? Well, let's just say there are some things the human mind isn't meant to understand. But we weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. Mary's house was small but felt safe, like it had some kind of invisible shield around it. As soon as we burst through her door, she started spreading salt in a line across the doorway. The screams and footsteps outside got louder, angrier. "They can't come in," Mary said calmly, lighting sage bundles. "Not unless we invite them." That's when we heard a voice outside. It was Michael's voice, crying for help. But Michael was right next to us, holding his camera tight. Then we heard Helen's voice, then mine, all begging to be let in. Mary just kept lighting her sage, telling us to cover our ears. Through the windows, we could see them. Dozens of copies of people we knew. Red Thompson, the sheriff's deputy, even ourselves. But they all moved wrong, like puppets with tangled strings. Their faces kept shifting, melting, changing into animal features, and back again. "What are they?" Helen whispered, holding Michael close. "Skinwalkers," Mary said. "Ancient evil. They steal faces, wear them like clothes, but they're getting bolder. The droughts made them desperate for new skins." Suddenly, Mary grabbed Michael's camera. "Your flash, it hurts them because it shows their true form. No creature of darkness can stand being seen for what it really is." That's when we heard a thump from the back of the house. Mary's face went pale. "The real Red Thompson," she said. "We need to see." In Mary's back room, we found him, the real Red, tied up and unconscious. He looked thin, like he'd been there for days, which meant the Red Thompson we'd been talking to all this time. A crash came from the front room. They were breaking the windows. The salt line was our only protection now, but it wouldn't last long. We needed a plan. Mary pulled out an old box filled with mirrors and started hanging them on the walls. "Skinwalkers hate seeing their true reflection," she explained, "and with the camera flash." I understood her plan, but we had to time it perfectly. Outside, the voices were getting louder, the scratching more desperate. The temperature kept dropping, and frost was spreading across the windows. We could hear them whispering our names, promising to let us go if we just opened the door. Michael loaded his last flashbulb into his camera. Helen gripped a sage bundle like a weapon, and I held the door handle waiting for Mary's signal. What happened next would either save us or doom us all. Mary nodded, and I yanked the door open. What happened next still feels like a nightmare. The skinwalkers rushed in, but they hit the salt line and stopped, hissing like angry snakes. In the doorway, I saw something that looked like my wife, something that looked like my son, and 3 different Red Thompsons, all grinning with mouths full of sharp teeth. "Now!" Mary shouted. Michael took the picture. The flash lit up the room like daylight, bouncing off all the mirrors Mary had hung. The light hit the creatures from every angle. Their screams were horrible, like 100 animals crying out at once. And in that bright flash, we saw their true forms. They weren't human. They weren't animals either. They were something in between. Their bodies were twisting, changing, like clay being pulled apart. Faces melted away, showing what was underneath. Dark, empty things with too many eyes and mouths. "Again!" Mary yelled, throwing more salt. Michael took another picture. More screams, more twisted shapes running away from the light. But his camera was almost out of flash bulbs. Then Helen had an idea. She grabbed the car headlight from our emergency kit and plugged it into Mary's generator. The bright beam caught one of the creatures in mid-change, freezing it in place. The skinwalkers started backing away, shrieking. Their stolen faces were falling off like masks, revealing the darkness underneath. They crawled and slithered back into the night, leaving behind pieces of skin and cloth that looked like empty costumes. We stayed in Mary's house until sunrise, listening to their angry howls fade away. When morning came, we found the real Red Thompson was starting to wake up. He was weak but alive. Mary helped us pack up our RV quickly. "You need to leave," she said. "Now, before the sun sets again." As we drove away, I looked in the rear-view mirror. For a second, I thought I saw something following us. Something that moved like a shadow, but wasn't quite right. Michael was checking his photos, but most of them were blank, like the film had been burned. Only one picture came out clear. It showed our own faces in the crowd of skinwalkers that night. Helen squeezed my hand. "It's over," she said, but her voice shook a little. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But that night, that was 2 years ago. We tried to go back to our normal lives, but things were never quite the same. Helen's plant samples from that valley, the ones that didn't rot, started growing in strange ways. They changed color at night and moved when no one was watching. She had to burn them all. Michael doesn't take pictures anymore. He says his camera sometimes shows extra faces in family photos, faces that shouldn't be there, faces that look almost like us, but not quite. As for me, well, I noticed something a few weeks after we got home. A small mark on my palm, like a burn. It looks just like one of those symbols we saw carved into our RV that night. Sometimes it feels ice cold, especially when I'm alone. We get letters from Mary Running Horse every month. She always asks the same thing. Are you sure you're still you? Because that's the scariest part. We don't really know if we escaped that night. You see, I've been watching my family carefully. Sometimes, when they think no one's looking, they move differently. Helen's smile sometimes seems too wide. And Michael? Sometimes I catch him staring at his reflection, like he's trying to remember how to wear his face. Last week, I found dog prints in our backyard. They looked just like Max's, but they stopped suddenly, turning into something else. Something with too many toes that walked on two legs. The other day, Helen saw Red Thompson at our local grocery store, hundreds of miles from that valley. When she blinked, he was gone. And just yesterday, Michael asked me a strange question. "Dad, do you remember which one of us took the last photo that night?" I started to answer, but then I realized, I don't remember. I'm not sure any of us do. So now I keep my own camera ready with a fresh flash bulb. I check the mirrors more often than I should. And every night, I wonder, did we really escape from Skinwalker Valley? Or did something else come home with us, wearing our faces? My name is Tommy Winters, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1977, when I was just 15. Even now, decades later, my hands shake when I think about those 5 days in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. I've never told this story to anyone except my therapist, but I think it's time people knew the truth about what happened to my father and why I now return to those woods every winter. It started with a road trip in our old Winnebago Brave RV. Dad thought it would be a good way for us to bond. You know, just father and son stuff. We hadn't been close since he came back from Vietnam. Mom had passed away 2 years before, and Dad, well, he was there but not really there, if you know what I mean. He'd stare at nothing for hours, jump at loud noises, and sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night. His friend Uncle James, not my real uncle but Dad's war buddy, thought this camping trip would help Dad get better. James and his wife Linda were going to meet us there. I was excited, finally, a chance to spend time with my father without him zoning out or getting angry over small things. I remember that drive so clearly. The trees were losing their leaves, and the air had that sharp, cold smell that means winter is coming. Dad was actually talking more than usual, telling me about the fishing we'd do and how he used to camp there as a kid. For once, he seemed almost like the Dad I remembered from before the war. We stopped at this small store near the entrance to the park. That's when things first felt wrong. The old Native American man behind the counter kept staring at Dad with this weird look. When Dad went to get something from the RV, the old man grabbed my arm. His hand was ice cold. "Blood moon coming," he whispered. "The wendigo wakes. You shouldn't be here, boy. Not now. Not with a man carrying shadows in his eyes." I didn't understand what he meant then. I wish I had. Maybe if we turned around right there, everyone would still be alive. But we didn't. We drove on, deeper into the woods, while the sun sank behind the trees and the shadows grew longer. That first night, I heard screams across the lake. Dad said it was just wolves. But I'd heard wolves before. This was different. This sounded like someone or something trying to sound human and not quite getting it right. Little did I know, those screams were just the beginning of our nightmare. The next morning started out normal enough. I woke up early. The RV was freezing cold, even though Dad had left the heater on all night. When I looked out the window, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There were weird tracks in the mud around our campsite. They looked kind of like deer prints, but way too big, and they seemed to walk on 2 legs instead of 4. "Dad," I called out, still staring at the tracks. "You need to see this." Dad came over, and his face changed when he saw them. I knew that look. It was the same one he got when fireworks went off on the 4th of July. His hand started shaking a bit. "It's probably just a bear," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Around breakfast time, Uncle James and Aunt Linda showed up in their truck. Aunt Linda made us all hot chocolate, while Uncle James and Dad talked about their camping plans. Everything felt better with more people around. But then Uncle James said something that made me freeze mid-sip. You guys hear those screams last night? Never heard anything like that in all my years camping? Dad tried to brush it off, but Aunt Linda looked worried. She'd grown up in these parts and said the locals never came to this section of the lake, especially not in late fall. Later that afternoon, I went to collect firewood with Uncle James. The forest was really quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That's when we found it. A deer, or what was left of it. The weird thing was, even though it wasn't that cold out, the deer was frozen solid, like it had been in a freezer. Its body was twisted in a way that didn't look natural, and there were these strange marks on its skin. Uncle James took one look and said we needed to head back. But as we turned around, we heard this sound, like someone walking through the trees, but the footsteps were too heavy, too slow. "Run," Uncle James whispered. "Don't look back." We ran all the way back to camp. When we told Dad and Aunt Linda what we'd found, Dad's face went white. He went to the RV and got his old Army radio out, trying to get a signal. That's when we started hearing it, this weird chanting coming through the static. It didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. The sun was setting now, and the temperature was dropping fast. Way too fast for a normal autumn evening. Aunt Linda kept saying we should leave, but when Dad tried to start the RV, it made this horrible grinding noise and wouldn't turn over. We were stuck here, and something out there was watching us. I could feel it. That night, none of us slept well. The temperature kept dropping, and our breath came out in white puffs inside the RV. Uncle James said he'd take first watch while the rest of us tried to sleep. I was curled up in my sleeping bag when I heard Aunt Linda get up to use the bathroom. A few minutes later, Dad suddenly sat up straight. "Where's James?" he asked. We looked around. Uncle James wasn't in his chair by the window anymore. The flashlight he'd been holding was on the floor, still on, making weird shadows on the walls. "James?" Dad called out, opening the RV door. The cold hit us like a slap in the face. "Linda?" No answer. Dad grabbed his flashlight and jacket. "Tommy, stay in the RV. Lock the door behind me." But Dad? No arguments. Lock the door. I watched from the window as Dad's flashlight beam moved through the darkness. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it. After what felt like forever, Dad came back with Aunt Linda. She was shaking and crying, but no Uncle James. "He's gone," Aunt Linda kept saying. "We have to find him." Dad made her sit down and gave her some hot coffee. That's when I noticed something weird. She kept licking her lips and looking at our cooler where we kept the meat for the trip. "I found this," Dad said quietly, putting something on the table. It was Uncle James's jacket. It was covered in frost, like it had been in a freezer, and it was torn into strips. There was something dark on it that looked like blood. Aunt Linda grabbed the jacket and pressed it to her face, breathing deeply. There was something wrong about the way she did it. Dad must have noticed too, because he pulled me aside. "Tommy," he whispered, "I need you to be very careful around Linda. Something's not right." "What do you mean? What's happening, Dad?" Before he could answer, we heard it, that scream again, but closer this time. It sounded like Uncle James calling for help, but wrong. Like someone trying to copy his voice but not getting it quite right. Aunt Linda stood up suddenly. "James? James, is that you?" She moved toward the door. "Linda, no." Dad grabbed her arm. "That's not James." She turned to look at us, and I'll never forget her face. Her eyes had this hungry look, and her teeth. They seemed sharper somehow. "I need to feed," she said in a voice that didn't sound like hers at all. The temperature in the RV dropped even more, and the windows started frosting over from the inside. Outside, something tall and skinny moved past our window. Something that walked on two legs, but definitely wasn't human. Things got really bad after that. Aunt Linda started acting stranger by the minute. She kept scratching her skin and mumbling about being hungry. Dad locked her in the RV's small bathroom when she tried to bite him. Then the blizzard came out of nowhere. It wasn't supposed to snow for weeks, but suddenly, we couldn't see more than a few feet outside the windows. The wind howled so loud, it sounded like screaming. "Dad," I whispered. What's happening to Aunt Linda? He sat down next to me, his face looking older than I'd ever seen it. Remember those stories the store owner was talking about the wendigo? He took a deep breath. I've seen something like this before in the war. Not exactly the same, but there are things in this world, Tommy, things that can get inside people's heads, make them change. A loud bang came from the bathroom, making us both jump. Aunt Linda was scratching at the door, her nails making horrible scraping sounds. "So hungry," she moaned. "Please, let me out." I went to check our cooler and found a horrible surprise. All our meat was gone, and there were bloody bite marks in the plastic containers. The weird thing was, the blood was frozen solid. That's when we heard another sound outside, something walking in the snow, coming closer to our RV. The steps were heavy, and something was dragging along the side of our vehicle. Dad grabbed his hunting knife and pulled me away from the windows. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "don't look directly at it. And if I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." The RV door started to frost over, ice crystals spreading across it like spider webs. Through the frozen window, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. A tall, skeletal figure. Its skin stretched tight over bones, with antlers growing from its head. It was carrying something. It was Uncle James's body, frozen solid like that deer we found. The bathroom door suddenly burst open. Aunt Linda came out, but she didn't look like Aunt Linda anymore. Her skin was gray, her fingers had grown longer, and her mouth. There were too many teeth. Dad pushed me behind him and raised his knife. "Tommy," he said calmly, "when I count to 3, I want you to open the emergency exit and run toward the store. Don't stop for anything." But Dad, 1. The thing outside started scratching at our door. 2. Aunt Linda crouched like she was ready to pounce. 3. Everything happened so fast after Dad yelled, "3." I yanked open the emergency exit and cold air rushed in. Behind me, I heard Aunt Linda make this horrible shrieking sound. Dad shouted, "Run, Tommy, run!" I jumped out into the snow. It was freezing and deep, making it hard to run. The wind was so strong I could barely see where I was going. Behind me, I heard crashes and screams coming from the RV. Then I heard Dad yell in pain. I wanted to go back so badly, but I remembered what Dad said. "Keep running, don't look back." But I was so cold, and the snow was getting deeper. My legs felt like they were turning to ice. Suddenly, I tripped and fell. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The tall creature, the wendigo, was standing right in front of me. It was even more horrible up close. Its skin was like old paper stretched over bones. And its eyes, they were completely black and empty, like looking into holes in the night sky. But then, something amazing happened. Dad came running out of nowhere, holding his army knife. He had these weird marks glowing on his arms, the same kind we'd seen at the Native American store. "You can't have him," Dad shouted. He stood between me and the monster. "Tommy, the store owner gave me something. It's in my jacket pocket, get it!" I reached into his pocket and found a small leather pouch with strange symbols on it. "Open it," Dad yelled, still facing the wendigo. "The markings, they'll protect you." My hands were shaking as I opened the pouch. Inside was some kind of powder that glowed slightly. As soon as I touched it, the symbols from the pouch started appearing on my skin, burning but not hurting. Dad turned to me one last time. His eyes were clear, clearer than I'd seen them since before the war. "I love you, son. Now close your eyes." Dad, no. But he had already charged at the wendigo, the knife glowing with the same symbols that were on his arms. There was a bright flash, a sound like ice cracking, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, the blizzard had stopped. The wendigo was gone. So was Dad. All that was left was his knife in the snow, the blade completely frozen. The marks on my skin were now permanent, like tattoos that sometimes glow when I'm in those woods. I found out later that Dad knew what he was doing all along. The store owner had told him about the wendigo, about how it wakes up during the blood moon to feed. Dad took the protection pouch, knowing he might have to save me. They found me the next morning, walking along the road near the store. The police searched the area for days but never found Dad's body, or Uncle James's, or what was left of Aunt Linda. The RV was there, covered in ice, with deep scratches all over it. Nobody could explain the strange marks on my skin or why everything in a mile radius was frozen solid even though it was still fall. The old store owner took me in until my relatives could come get me. He told me something I'll never forget. "Your father," he said, "he was chosen. The marks only appear on those meant to protect others. And now," he touched the symbols on my arm, "you've been chosen too." He explained that every year, during the blood moon, the wendigo wakes up hungry. It needs someone to guard the borders, to keep it from hunting innocent people. That's why I go back now. The marks on my skin burn whenever the wendigo is active, calling me back to those woods. I'm 63 now, and I've spent every winter for the past 48 years protecting people from what lurks in those woods. Sometimes, on really cold nights when the moon is full and red, I think I see Dad out there, not as a ghost, but as something else, a guardian, like me. He's still protecting people in his own way. Last week, I saw a family in a new RV heading toward the Boundary Waters. The blood moon is coming again. That's why I'm telling this story now. If you're ever up in northern Minnesota and you see strange tracks in the snow, or hear screams that sound almost human but not quite, don't convince yourself it's just the wind. Don't ignore the warnings. And if you see an old man with glowing marks on his arms telling you to turn back, please listen. Because not everyone who goes into those woods comes out again. And the wendigo, it's always hungry. The marks on my arms are burning right now. It's time for me to go back. Someone has to protect the borders. Someone has to keep watch. Dad understood that in the end. And now, so do I. My name is Rick Morrison, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1985. I still get chills thinking about those 7 days in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but I need to share this story. Maybe then, someone will believe me, or at least understand why I never returned to work as a forest ranger. I was 38 then, working as a hunting guide after quitting my ranger job. My wife, Catherine, she's a wildlife biologist, had convinced me to help with this documentary about wolf migration. Seemed simple enough at the time. Just me, Catherine, a filmmaker named Peter Walsh, his sound person Beth O'Connor, and our local deputy Thomas Wilson. We drove up there in this old 1983 Fleetwood RV, not the fanciest thing, but it had enough space for all our gear and would be our home for the next week. The fall colors were just starting to show, and hunting season was beginning. Perfect timing for filming, we thought. Man, how wrong we were. I remember that first morning so clearly. The air was crisp, leaves crunching under our boots as we set up camp. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But there was something in the way the local hunters looked at us when we stopped for supplies. They were trying to warn us. I realized that now. They kept talking about people going missing, about howls in the night that didn't sound like any wolf they'd ever heard. I should have listened. I should have remembered what I saw in these same woods when I was just a kid. But I didn't want to believe it then, and I sure didn't want to believe it now. How could I tell them that I'd seen something impossible 30 years ago, something that had been haunting my dreams ever since? Let me start from the beginning, from that first day when everything still made sense. Before we found those tracks, before the wolves started acting strange, before the blood moon revealed what was really hiding in those ancient forests. And trust me, what I'm about to tell you, I wish it was just a story, but every word of it is true. That first afternoon, we started setting up our equipment around the RV. Peter was fiddling with his cameras while Beth tested her microphones in the woods. Catherine was excited, marking spots on her map where we might find wolf packs. Everything felt normal, just like any other filming job. But then, Tom, that's Deputy Wilson, came by with some news that made my stomach turn. 3 hunters had gone missing in the past week. Not just wandered off, but vanished completely. Their trucks were still parked at the trailhead. Food left at their camps, but no sign of the men themselves. "Never seen anything like it," Tom said, shaking his head. "Been deputy here for 15 years, and people don't just disappear like this." As the sun started setting, we heard our first strange howl. I've heard plenty of wolves in my life. It comes with being a ranger for so long. But this was different. It was deeper, almost like it was coming from something much bigger. Catherine noticed it too. I saw her freeze while checking her equipment. "Rick," she called out, "come look at this." I walked over to where she was standing, her flashlight pointed at the ground. There, in the soft mud, was a footprint. But it wasn't from any animal I knew. It was huge, maybe 15 inches long, and looked almost human-like, but with deep claw marks at the ends. "Could be a bear," I said, not believing my own words. Bears don't leave prints like that, and we all knew it. That night, huddled in the RV, none of us slept much. The howls kept coming, closer now, and different wolf calls answered from all around us. Through the windows, we could see eyes reflecting in the darkness, dozens of them, watching us. Beth's audio equipment kept picking up strange noises, low rumbles that made the RV's windows vibrate. Peter tried filming out the window, but every time he pointed his camera toward the eyes in the darkness, it would start glitching. "Guys," Catherine whispered, "I don't think we're dealing with normal wolves here." Looking back, that was the moment everything changed. We should have packed up and left right then, but we didn't. We stayed, thinking we were about to make the wildlife documentary of the century. We had no idea we were about to become part of something much darker, something that had been waiting in these woods for a very, very long time. The worst part? This was just the beginning of our first night. I remember waking up early the next morning feeling tired and uneasy. None of us had gotten much sleep after what we'd seen and heard. The strange thing was, when we looked outside, everything seemed perfectly normal. Too normal, actually. Peter wanted to start filming right away. "If there's something unusual going on with the wolves," he said, "we need to catch it on camera." I couldn't argue with that, even though something in my gut was telling me to be careful. We split into 2 groups. Catherine and I went north to check out some of the abandoned hunter camps, while Peter, Beth, and Deputy Wilson headed east to set up more cameras. Before leaving, we all agreed to use our walkie-talkies every hour to check in, just to be safe. The forest felt different that morning. Usually, you'd hear birds singing, squirrels rushing through the trees, all the normal forest sounds. But everything was quiet, dead quiet. The only sound was our boots crunching on fallen leaves. The first hunter's camp we found made my blood run cold. The tent was shredded, but not like a bear attack. The tears were too precise, almost like huge claw marks. Catherine found their food still hanging in a tree, untouched. Their rifle was still there too, loaded but never fired. "Rick," Catherine called out softly, "look at these tracks." All around the camp were those same massive footprints we'd seen last night. But there was something else, the wolf tracks. They were everywhere, but they made no sense. The wolves had just stood there, in a perfect circle around the camp, like they were waiting for something. That's when our walkie-talkie crackled to life. It was Beth, and she sounded scared. "Rick? Catherine? Are you there? Something's wrong with our equipment. All of it. The cameras keep showing these weird shadows, and my audio recordings. You need to hear this." I was about to respond when we heard it, that deep, unnatural howl again. But this time it was close, very close, and it came from between us and where the others were. Catherine grabbed my arm. "Rick," she whispered, pointing to the trees ahead of us. Through the branches, we could see something moving, something big, standing on 2 legs. The walkie-talkie crackled again. "Rick, please answer." "The wolves, they're surrounding us, but they're just standing there. And there's something else out here with them, something bigger. I raised the walkie-talkie to respond, but before I could, we heard Deputy Wilson scream. The sound echoed through the trees, followed by that horrible howl again. And then, everything went silent. My heart was pounding as Catherine and I ran toward the screams. The forest seemed to get darker with each step, even though it was only mid-morning. We kept trying to reach the others on the walkie-talkie, but all we got was static and these weird, whispering sounds. As we got closer, we started finding pieces of camera equipment scattered on the ground, broken lenses, torn cables, and Beth's favorite microphone smashed to pieces. But no blood. That was strange. "Look," Catherine whispered, pointing to the ground. The wolf tracks were everywhere again, but this time they all led in the same direction, like the whole pack had moved together. And mixed in with them were those huge, human-like footprints. We found Peter first. He was up in a tree, shaking, his face white as a sheet. When we called up to him, he just pointed ahead without saying a word. Beth was nearby, hiding behind a fallen log. She was clutching her backup recorder like it was her lifeline. "I got it," she kept saying. "I got it all on audio." But Deputy Wilson, he was gone. His police radio lay broken on the ground, and his gun was still in its holster, hanging from a branch. It controlled them. Peter finally spoke, climbing down from the tree. "The wolves, they just stood there, staring at us with these weird glowing eyes. And then this thing stepped out of the shadows. It was huge, Rick, like 8 feet tall at least. And the wolves, they did whatever it wanted." Beth played the recording for us. Through all the static and growling, we could hear this deep, rumbling sound. Like words, but not in any language I'd ever heard. And under that, dozens of wolf howls all at once. "We need to get back to the RV," I said. "Right now." But when we turned around, the forest looked different. Trees we'd passed just minutes ago weren't where they should be. It was like the whole forest had rearranged itself. That's when Catherine grabbed my sleeve. "Rick, the symbols." We all looked up. Carved into the trees around us were these strange marks, fresh ones, the sap still dripping. They formed a perfect circle around us. And somewhere in the forest, that deep howl echoed again, closer this time, much closer. The worst part? We all knew we weren't just dealing with a wild animal anymore. This thing, whatever it was smart, and it was playing with us. We had to get out of there. But as we looked around at the changed forest, we all realized the same terrible truth. We had no idea which way to go. We spent hours trying to find our way back to the RV. The sun was starting to set, and the forest kept getting darker and colder. None of our compasses worked. They just kept spinning in circles. Even the GPS on our equipment was going crazy. "Rick," Catherine said quietly, "remember those old stories? The ones the local tribes used to tell about these woods?" I did remember. Stories about a creature that could control wolves, that could change the paths in the forest. Stories I'd tried to forget since I was a kid. But before I could answer, Beth's recorder suddenly came to life on its own. Through the static, we heard Deputy Wilson's voice. "Found something. Old burial grounds. They're everywhere. The symbols. Oh God, it's here." The recording ended with that same deep howl we'd been hearing. Beth's hands were shaking as she held the recorder. "I didn't record this," she whispered. "This just appeared on the tape." That's when we smelled it. Something like wet dog and rotting leaves, but much stronger. The air got colder, and this weird fog started rolling in around our feet. Through the trees, we could see eyes reflecting in the darkness, dozens of them, all at different heights, some at wolf level, but one pair much, much higher up. Peter raised his camera, and for once, it worked. But what we saw in the viewfinder made us all freeze. Behind us, barely visible in the fog, was this huge, dark shape. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its eyes glowed yellow, and its head was like a wolf's, but wrong somehow. Too big, too human-like. "Nobody move," I whispered. "Nobody make a sound." We all stood there, barely breathing, as this thing moved closer. The wolves came with it, walking slowly, their eyes glowing the same yellow color. They formed a circle around us, but they weren't acting like normal wolves. They were too organized, too calm. Suddenly, Catherine gasped. She was staring at her tablet, which had somehow turned itself on. On the screen was a map of the area, but it showed something we hadn't noticed before. All those weird symbols we'd seen carved in the trees. They made a pattern, a huge pattern, and we were standing right in the center of it. "Rick," she said, her voice shaking, "these are the same symbols from your grandfather's books, the ones he warned you about." The creature moved closer, and now we could all see it clearly. Its fur was black as night, but parts of it seemed to fade into shadow, like it wasn't fully there. And then it did something none of us were prepared for. It spoke. "Morrison," it growled, in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. "You've come back." That's when I realized this thing knew me. It had been waiting for me. And suddenly, all those nightmares I'd had as a kid made terrible, perfect sense. My whole body went cold when I heard it say my name. Memories from my childhood came flooding back. That night 30 years ago when I'd seen something in these same woods. Something I'd forced myself to forget. You're the one," I managed to say. "From when I was a kid, by the old oak tree." The creature's yellow eyes seemed to glow brighter. "You were marked," it growled, "just like your grandfather before you." Catherine grabbed my hand. "Rick, what's it talking about?" Before I could answer, Peter's camera started making this weird buzzing sound. When we looked at the screen, everything was distorted, but we could see something impossible. The footage showed multiple creatures, not just one, moving through the trees around us. But when we looked up, we could only see the one in front of us. "The portal," the creature said, pointing one long clawed finger toward the burial mounds. "It weakens. The blood moon comes." Suddenly, all the wolves started howling at once. The sound was deafening. Beth's recorder exploded in her hands, and Peter's camera sparked and died. The fog got thicker, swirling around us like it was alive. "Rick," Catherine shouted over the noise, "look at the sky." Through the trees, we could see the moon rising. It was huge and red, the blood moon. As its light touched the forest, the symbols carved in the trees started to glow with a faint blue light. The creature threw its head back and let out that terrible howl again. But this time, something was different. Its body started to change, growing larger, more twisted. The shadows around it seemed to come alive. "Run!" I screamed, pushing everyone toward what I hoped was the way back to the RV. The wolves didn't chase us, they just stood there, watching with their glowing eyes. As we ran, I could hear the creature's voice in my head. "You can't escape, Morrison. The mark binds you. When the portal opens, you must choose." We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. The ground under our feet started to feel wrong, like it was shifting. And behind us, getting closer and closer, we could hear something big moving through the trees. Then Peter tripped and fell. When we turned to help him up, we saw what he'd stumbled over. Deputy Wilson's badge, covered in something dark. And next to it was a piece of paper, a page from my grandfather's journal that I thought I'd lost years ago. The forest around us went completely silent. And in that silence, we heard the creature's footsteps getting closer, and closer, and closer. I grabbed the journal page with shaking hands. Even in the red moonlight, I could read my grandfather's messy handwriting. "The Guardian seeks a successor. The bloodline must continue. The portal must be protected." Suddenly, the RV's headlights cut through the darkness ahead of us. We'd somehow made it back, but something was wrong. The metal of the RV was warped and twisted, like something incredibly strong had been bending it. "Inside! Now!" I yelled, pushing everyone toward the door. But Peter stood frozen, staring at something behind us. When I turned around, my heart nearly stopped. The dogman was there, standing at its full height, probably twice as tall as me now. Behind it, the wolves had formed a perfect half circle, their eyes all glowing that same unnatural yellow. The creature's fur seemed to move like smoke, and now I could see symbols glowing on its chest, the same ones from the trees. "Your grandfather understood," it growled. "He took the mark willingly. Now it's your time, Morrison." Catherine grabbed my arm. "Rick, look at your hand." I held up my right hand, and there it was. A glowing symbol appearing on my palm, the same one I'd had as a birthmark my whole life, the one my grandfather had too. "The portal grows weak," the creature continued, pointing toward the burial mounds. "Without a guardian, they will come through, all of them." That's when we heard it, this horrible tearing sound, like reality itself was being ripped apart. Over by the burial mounds, the air started to shimmer and twist. Through the distortion, I could see things, dark shapes moving, trying to get through. "Choose now," the dogman growled. "Take your grandfather's place, or watch them enter your world." Peter suddenly raised his backup camera, but before he could start filming, 3 wolves leaped forward. What happened next? I still have nightmares about it. There was nothing we could do. Beth screamed and ran for the RV, but she never made it. The ground beneath her feet suddenly turned to quicksand, pulling her down. Catherine and I tried to reach her, but the wolves formed a wall between us. "Last chance, Morrison," the creature said. "The blood moon is almost at its peak." Looking at Catherine's terrified face, I knew what I had to do. Just like my grandfather had done 30 years ago, I had to make a choice, a terrible choice. And that's when the true horror of that night really began. I looked at Catherine one last time and whispered, "I'm sorry." Then I stepped forward, toward the dogman. The symbol on my palm was burning now, glowing brighter with each step. "Rick, no!" Catherine screamed, but the wolves kept her back. As I got closer to the creature, memories flooded back. That night when I was 8 years old, seeing my grandfather talking to this same being. How he disappeared the next day, leaving only his journal behind. It all made sense now. The portal by the burial mounds was getting bigger. Through it, I could see shadows moving, creatures worse than the dogman trying to break through. The air felt wrong, like everything was about to break apart. "The choice must be willing," the dogman growled. "Just as your grandfather chose." I looked back at Catherine one more time. She was crying, trying to understand what was happening. The wolves around her hadn't moved, just watching with those glowing eyes. "If I do this," I said, my voice shaking, "will you let her go? Will you let her live?" The creature nodded slowly. "She will be safe, but you must stay, forever." I reached out my marked hand toward the dogman. The moment I did, everything changed. The symbol on my palm burst with blue light, shooting up my arm like lightning. I could feel something happening to me, changing me. It hurt worse than anything I'd ever felt. Catherine screamed my name again, but it sounded far away now. I could feel the forest around me, feel every tree, every wolf, every shadow. I could feel the portal pulling at the world, trying to tear it open. "Rick, please!" Catherine's voice was fading. The last thing I remember as a human was looking at my hands as they changed, watching fur black as night spread across my skin. I could feel myself growing taller, stronger. The forest wasn't just around me anymore, it was part of me. The old dogman stepped back, fading into shadows as I took his place. The wolves turned to me now, their eyes full of recognition. They were mine to command. I wanted to tell Catherine I was sorry, that I had no choice. But when I opened my mouth, only that deep, terrible howl came out, the same one that had haunted us for days. Through eyes that could now see in ways I never imagined, I watched as the wolves led Catherine back to the RV. She kept looking back, but I stayed in the shadows. I couldn't let her see what I'd become. That was 2 years ago. Catherine made it out alive, just like the dogman promised. She tried to come back once, to find me, but the forest wouldn't let her. It protects me now, just like I protect it. Sometimes on quiet nights, I hear people in these woods. Campers, hunters, people looking for answers about what happened to us. I make sure the wolves keep them away from the burial mounds, away from the portal, away from the truth. Because that's my job now. That's what my grandfather did and his grandfather before him. We're the guardians, the protectors. And if you're ever in Michigan's Upper Peninsula and you hear a howl that sounds almost human, just turn around, go back the way you came. Because I'm still here, watching, waiting, protecting. And not everyone gets the chance to walk away like Catherine did. My name is Timothy Reynolds, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1968, when I was 17. You probably won't believe me, honestly. Sometimes I still have trouble believing it myself, but every word of this story is true. I guess I should start by saying I wasn't exactly the perfect son back then. My grades were dropping, I was getting into fights at school, and I kept sneaking out at night. Mom and Dad were worried sick about me. But I didn't care. I was angry at the world and wanted everyone to know it. That's why when my parents announced we were going on a family camping trip to the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas, I knew exactly what it was, an intervention disguised as a vacation. Dad had just bought this old 1967 Winnebago Brave, and he thought a nice family trip would fix everything, if only we knew what was waiting for us in those mountains. I remember that day so clearly. It was late spring, and this weird fog had settled over the mountains. Not your normal morning fog that burns off by noon, but something different. Something that seemed to have a life of its own. The locals called it mystery fog season, but we would soon learn it was much more than that. Mom was excited about the trip because she was really into studying local folklore and legends. Dad, being an ex-military guy who knew everything about survival stuff, thought it would be a perfect chance to teach me some life skills. Me? I just sat in the back of the RV with my headphones on, plotting how to make this trip as miserable for them as possible. But let me tell you something. After what happened in those mountains, after what we saw in those caves, and after what we learned about the things that live in the deep parts of the Ozarks, well, let's just say my teenage attitude was the least of our problems. The first day in the mountains started out pretty normal. Dad parked our Winnebago in this secluded camping spot near some tall pine trees. The fog was getting thicker, and there was this weird silence, the kind where you can't even hear birds chirping. While Dad was setting up camp, I wandered off a bit. Yeah, I know, typical rebellious teenager move. That's when I found this old moonshine still hidden between some rocks. It looked ancient, all rusty and covered in vines, but something about it gave me the creeps, like someone had just been there, even though it was clearly abandoned for years. Then I heard this sound, sort of like a flute, but not quite. It was faint, coming from somewhere deep in the valley. I remember thinking it was probably just the wind, but the trees weren't moving at all. When I got back to camp, Mom was talking to this old lady who had appeared out of nowhere. Her name was Alice Cooper. Not the rock star, she joked, and she said she was some kind of local healer. She kept looking at me weird, like she knew something about me that I didn't. "You folks picked an interesting time to visit," she said, warming her hands by our campfire. "The fog season brings out all sorts of things in these mountains." The way she said things made my skin crawl. Mom, of course, got super excited and started asking Alice about local legends. That's when we first heard about the Hollow People. According to Alice, they were these creatures that lived in the cave systems under the mountains. The locals avoided talking about them, but everyone knew someone who'd seen something strange in the fog. Sheriff Brooks showed up later that evening. He said he was just doing his regular patrol, but I noticed how he kept looking into the woods, like he was searching for something. He mentioned that some teenagers had gone missing last week, but quickly changed the subject when Mom asked for details. That night I couldn't sleep. The fog had gotten so thick I could barely see the trees outside our RV window, and that flute sound, it was back, but closer this time, much closer. Dad said it was probably just some local kids messing around, but I saw him check his old military knife before going to bed. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The real horror was still waiting for us, hidden in the fog and darkness of those ancient mountains. I woke up early the next morning, but something felt different. The fog was even thicker, and there was this weird smell in the air, like wet leaves and something rotting. Mom and Dad were still asleep in the RV, so I decided to take a walk. Big mistake. I hadn't gone far when I saw them. At first, I thought they were just tall trees in the fog, but trees don't move. They were these really tall, skinny figures, kind of white-gray like the fog itself. They were swaying back and forth, even though there wasn't any wind. I froze. My whole body went cold, and I couldn't even scream. One of them turned towards me. I couldn't see a face, but I felt it looking at me. That's when I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I crashed right into Dad, who was coming out of the RV. "Tim, what's wrong?" he asked, grabbing my shoulders. I was shaking so bad I could barely speak. When I finally told him what I saw, he grabbed his rifle and went to check it out. Of course, there was nothing there. Just empty forest and fog. Mom spent that morning reading her old books about the area's history. She found something about weird rituals that happened in these mountains before the Civil War. Meanwhile, Dad found these creepy wooden totems stuck in the ground near our campsite. They looked old, but the carvings were fresh, like someone had just made them. Things got worse as the day went on. Our RV's radio kept turning on by itself, playing nothing but static. Then we'd hear voices in the static, not English, something older. Even the lights inside the RV started flickering in this weird pattern, like they were trying to tell us something. But the worst part? We found a rabbit near our campsite. It was still alive, but wrong. It looked like someone had turned it inside out, but it was still breathing, still moving. Dad put it out of its misery, but I'll never forget its eyes. They were completely white, like it had seen something no living thing should see. That night, the flute music started again. But this time, we could hear something else with it, a deep, rumbling sound, like a giant cat purring. It was coming from the caves we'd spotted earlier. Mom said we should leave, but Dad insisted we were safer in the RV than driving these mountain roads in the thick fog. I remember sitting there, watching the fog swirl outside our windows, when I saw more of those tall figures moving through the trees. But this time, they weren't alone. Something else was out there with them, something much bigger. The third day started with screams. Not human screams, but something that sounded like a mix between a mountain lion and a woman crying. Dad called it the Ozark howler, but I don't think even he knew what we were really dealing with. We were eating breakfast when Sheriff Brooks's patrol car came racing up to our campsite. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. 3 more teenagers went missing last night, he told us, his hands shaking as he drank Mom's coffee. Found their car near the old cave entrance, but no sign of them. That's when I started feeling weird, really weird, like something was trying to get inside my head. I kept hearing whispers, even when nobody was talking. And sometimes, when I looked in the RV's mirror, my reflection would move a second too late, like it was trying to catch up with me. Mom found something scary in her research. She showed us this old newspaper from 1866 that talked about a whole town that disappeared in these mountains. The only thing they found was a cave full of strange markings and what the paper called evidence of unholy rituals. Around noon, we heard engines. A search party was gathering to look for the missing teens. 5 local men with dogs and gear headed into the caves. Dad wanted to help, but Sheriff Brooks told us to stay put. "Whatever's in those caves," he said, "it's not natural." As the day went on, the fog got so thick, we could barely see 10 feet in front of us. The search party's radios went dead after an hour. Then we heard the howling again, but this time it was different, like multiple creatures calling to each other from different parts of the mountain. Alice Cooper showed up just before sunset, looking worried. She gave me this weird necklace made of bones and herbs. "Wear it," she said. "They're drawn to you, Timothy. They want something from you. That's when everything went crazy. The ground started shaking, and we heard screams coming from the cave. Real human screams this time. Sheriff Brooks ran toward the sound, disappearing into the fog. We waited, but he never came back. Later that night, we found his flashlight near the cave entrance. Next to it was something that made Mom throw up and Dad turn white as a sheet. Sheriff Brooks's badge twisted into an impossible shape, like it was made of warm taffy. And there was something written in the dirt next to it, but not in any language I'd ever seen. I didn't tell my parents, but I could read it. Somehow, I knew exactly what it said, and that's when I realized why these things were really here, and what they wanted from me. That night, things got much worse. Dad decided we should stay in the RV with all the doors locked. But around midnight, I started feeling like something was pulling me, like a rope tied around my mind, trying to drag me toward the caves. The 5 men from the search party were still missing. We could hear their dogs howling somewhere in the fog, but the sounds kept moving around, like they were being chased by something. Then Alice Cooper appeared out of nowhere, pounding on our RV door. She looked different, younger somehow, her eyes glowing with a strange blue light. "They're coming," she said. "The Hollow people are hungry, and they've chosen Timothy." Mom started crying when Alice told us the truth. She wasn't just some local healer, she was a guardian, part of an ancient group that had been protecting these mountains for centuries. The creatures in the caves, she said, were older than America itself. They needed a new host every 50 years, and somehow they had picked me. Just then, we heard it, a sound like 1,000 whispers all at once. Through the RV windows, we saw them coming out of the fog. The Hollow people. Tall, pale figures sliding through the darkness. But behind them was something else, something huge. The real Ozark howler. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. Its body kept changing shape, like smoke in the wind, but with glowing red eyes. "Get to the burial cave," Alice told us. "It's the only safe place. I'll hold them off." We grabbed what we could and ran. I could hear the creatures chasing us, their feet making weird squelching sounds in the mud. Dad was leading the way with his rifle, and Mom kept holding my hand, pulling me along. The burial cave was different from the others. It had strange symbols carved all around the entrance. As we ran inside, I looked back and saw something that still gives me nightmares. Alice was standing there, her arms raised, speaking in some ancient language. Her whole body was glowing now, and the Hollow people were shrieking, trying to get away from her light. But the howler, it just laughed. A deep, horrible sound that made the ground shake. It moved toward Alice like a wave of darkness, and that's when we realized what she was about to do. "Close your eyes," she screamed at us. "Don't look, no matter what you hear." What happened next? Well, that's when we learned the real truth about these mountains, and why my family was really brought here. Inside the burial cave, everything got quiet, too quiet. The only sound was our heavy breathing and water dripping somewhere deep inside. Dad's flashlight showed ancient drawings on the walls, pictures of the Hollow people, and something that looked like the howler. Mom started reading the symbols, her voice shaking. "This isn't just a cave," she said. "It's a doorway. They've been here for thousands of years, taking people, making them, like them." That's when we heard Alice's final scream outside, followed by a flash of blue light so bright it lit up the whole cave. Suddenly, I felt it, like ice in my veins. The howler was in my head, showing me things. I saw underground cities older than time. I saw what happened to the missing teenagers, to Sheriff Brooks, to the search party. They weren't dead, but what happened to them was worse than dying. "Tim," Dad's voice snapped me back. "Fight it, son." But my body wasn't listening. I started walking toward the back of the cave like a puppet on strings. That's when Mom found it, an old stone altar with a bowl carved into it. Inside were ashes and bones, and something else, a piece of paper, fresh paper. It was a letter from Alice. She knew this would happen. The letter explained everything, about how my family wasn't here by accident. We were chosen. Every 50 years, the creatures needed new guardians to keep them trapped in the mountains. That's why they wanted me. But Alice had found a way to break the cycle, and she'd written down the ritual. Just then, the hollow people started sliding into the cave. Dad tried shooting them, but the bullets went right through. Mom grabbed the letter and started reading the ritual words out loud. The creatures screeched. It was hurting them. The howler appeared at the cave entrance, its red eyes fixed on me. It was huge now, filling the whole opening. As Mom read faster, I felt something inside me getting stronger, fighting back against the howler's pull. That's when the cave started shaking. Rocks were falling everywhere. Dad grabbed Mom and pulled her behind a boulder, but I couldn't move. I was caught between the howler's power and something else, something Alice had left behind. Everything happened so fast after that. The howler was trying to drag me deeper into the cave, but the necklace Alice gave me started glowing hot. Mom was still reading the ritual, her voice getting stronger with each word. The hollow people were screaming now, their bodies twisting in impossible ways. "Tim," Dad shouted, reaching for me. "The altar! We need your blood on the altar!" I fought against the howler's pull, stumbling toward the stone altar. My nose was bleeding, and my head felt like it was about to explode. The howler roared, a sound so loud it made stones fall from the cave ceiling. Just as I reached the altar, we saw them, the missing teenagers, Sheriff Brooks, and the search party. They were different now, their skin pale and stretched, their eyes empty. They were becoming hollow people. They reached for us with long, twisted fingers. But something strange was happening to me. Every time Mom read another word of the ritual, I could see things clearer. I could see what the hollow people really were, what the howler was. Not just monsters, but guardians gone wrong, corrupted by time and darkness. I pressed my bleeding nose to the altar, and everything exploded in blue light, just like Alice's light. The hollow people shrieked and began to crumble like old paper. The howler fought back, its shape changing faster and faster, but it was too late. Mom finished the ritual, and the cave filled with a sound like 1,000 voices sighing at once. The howler's red eyes dimmed, and it started falling apart, piece by piece, like ashes in the wind. When it was over, we found the missing people lying on the cave floor, normal again, but unconscious. They wouldn't remember anything. Alice's letter said they wouldn't. But I remember. I remember everything. We also found something else in the cave that day, a hidden room full of government files. They knew about these creatures all along. They'd been watching, studying, keeping it secret. That's why we can't go back to our normal lives now, because I can still see them, not just in the Ozarks, but everywhere. The hollow people, the ancient things that live in dark places. They're still out there, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear that flute music. That's right. My son Jack is 17 now, just like I was back then. Last week, I noticed him staring out the window at the fog rolling in, the same way I used to. And yesterday, he told me he's been hearing flute music in his dreams. I never told him the whole story before, how could I? But now, sitting here in our house near those same Ozark mountains, I know it's time. The old necklace Alice gave me is glowing again, for the first time in 50 years. Mom and Dad are gone now, but they left all their research, all their notes about what really happened. The government files we found that day, they showed us something bigger. The Ozarks aren't the only place with hollow people. They're all over America, in every ancient mountain range, every deep forest. The howlers are their shepherds, keeping them hidden, choosing new guardians when needed. Last night, I saw Alice Cooper in my dreams. She looked just like she did that day, with her glowing blue eyes. "It's starting again," she said. "But this time, you know what to do." I'm looking at Jack right now as I tell this story. He's trying to act brave, but I can see the fear in his eyes. The same fear I had when I was his age. But there's something else too. That same strange power I felt in the cave. It runs in our blood now. The fog outside is getting thicker, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear that familiar howl. But we're ready this time. We know what's coming. The hollow people, the howlers, the ancient evil beneath these mountains. They don't know that we've been preparing for 50 years. So if you're ever driving through the Ozarks and see that strange fog rolling in, or hear what sounds like a flute playing in the distance, turn around. Drive away as fast as you can. Because not everyone has a guardian to protect them. Not everyone survives what lives in these mountains. And if you happen to meet a teenager named Jack Reynolds, just know this: he's not just any kid. He's the next guardian, and he's got a big job ahead of him. Because the fog season is here again, and the Hollow people are hungry.